and welcome to the Skillful podcast, where we explore DBT and RODBT skills to help you reduce emotional suffering, improve your relationships, and become more present in your life. I'm your host, Marielle Berg, a psychotherapist at the Bay Area DBT and Couples Counseling Center. So welcome back, Ed. Today we're going to be talking about validation and why it's so important in interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, I think that this is one of my favorite aspects of DBT is the focus on validation and how helpful it is in relationships.
So I think a good way to get started in talking about validation and why it's so important in all our relationships is to first talk about what invalidation is, to give listeners a sense of what invalidation looks like and what it feels like to be on the receiving end of being invalidated. So there are different types of invalidation, but I would say broadly, invalidation is when you are told either directly or indirectly that your thoughts or emotions or opinions either don't matter, don't make sense, are stupid somehow, or that you're overreacting. Another way of saying this is that invalidation is when someone responds to your private internal experience with some version of, no, that's not how it is, you're wrong, you're making a big deal out of nothing, let me explain why you're wrong. Or invalidation can look like being completely ignored altogether. So we might say that's invalidation by omission as well. And of course, if you've ever been on the receiving end of this, and we probably all have in one way or another, it's painful.
Yeah, I think that invalidation is just negating our own experience of our emotions. So we all have our emotional experiences. And if someone says like, that's not what you're feeling, or that's not okay to feel, or you shouldn't feel that way, when that is what we're feeling, we can easily become defensive and want to, defend our emotions instead of having someone start with, that's interesting what's going on, when we can explore it a little bit more deeply.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So the invalidation can put us on the defense. We want to try to prove why we're right or why our internal experience is important. And I think another piece of this on perhaps another level or a deeper level is that invalidation is a way of kind of questioning your own mind. Like you don't know what you're thinking. You don't know your own internal experience, which can feel really sort of lonely and isolating and confusing because we all have the need to be understood by others, especially by those closest to us. As I said a moment ago, and as you pointed to, Ed, some of the after effects of being invalidated can be that defensiveness coupled with anger, where you might want to insist like this is actually how it is, or potentially attacking the other person, saying like, you just don't care about me. Clearly, if you did, you would see it my way, when the other person may very well actually care for you. And we'll get more into this later in today's episode, because there is a way that you can validate someone's experience without necessarily having to agree with them. So now that we've sort of talked a little bit about what invalidation is and why it's painful to be on the receiving end, let's talk about what validation is and why it matters so much in relationships.
So basically validation is validating that someone else is having their experience, being able to express verbally and non-verbally that I am with you. I'm listening and I'm not judging. I'm trying to see things from your perspective. And that is, the best way to really connect and get more information out of someone else's personal experiences, where jumping quickly to, oh no, that's not what you meant, or that's not what you're feeling, or that doesn't make sense to feel that way. Starting with a little bit of like, I'm listening, I'm trying to understand, helps people open up a little bit more.
Absolutely. It increases intimacy and trust and safety. And validation is a necessary part of all relationships, from the most significant relationships, like a spouse or someone you're in an intimate relationship with, to friendships of all sorts, to work relationships. And I think it's really key, or sort of it acts as a really important kind of connector and social lubricant, because validation lets the other person know that you're listening. And that's like the first level of validation, which we'll also talk a little bit more about in a moment, because not being listened to hurts. So if you've ever been trying to talk with someone and you can tell that they're distracted and not listening, how does it feel?
Right.
Pretty crappy. It also lets the other person know that you're not judging them, as we were saying a moment ago, because feeling judged obviously hurts too and will totally put you on the defensive. And it communicates that you can see the world from the other person's perspective. Like you can put yourself in their shoes for a moment. And it can really help the other person feel supported.
And validation reduces the pressure we can feel to prove who's right. Because if we're trying to figure out, is my emotion right? Is their emotion right? Someone validating us or us validating someone else removes that pressure of like, who's right, who's wrong. Just we are all having our own experience. And also validation reduces anger and defensiveness. Validation is a way of letting the other person know that we understand their perspective, and it really feels good to receive that understanding. Helps us feel more connected and intimate and have more trust in other people and for them to have more trust in us.
Yeah, exactly. Another way that can be helpful to think about validation is this idea of intent versus impact, meaning that we might have an intent to not hurt someone's feelings, but that's very different than the impact that it has on someone else. So I want to share a personal example. So a friend of mine felt really dismissed by me when I kept saying no to their request to spend time together. And the reason why I was saying no so often is because I was going through several losses in my family. We had several elderly family members die in a short period of time, and this had a lot of ripple effects in my family and on my energy level and on my desire to be social, which isn't that high on my best day because I'm pretty introverted. And so I withdrew a bit more socially, and this friend kept reaching out and I kept saying no, or I couldn't. And eventually they confronted me because they felt really hurt. They began to feel like our friendship didn't matter, that I didn't value her, I didn't value our friendship, which we've had for many years. And this was not my intent at all. My intent was kind of to withdraw, to grieve, to sort of regroup and sort of, circle the wagons, we might say, as I was going through this process. And if I came back to her, that's not what I meant. How could you be so self-centered? I'm going through a grief process. It's ridiculous for you to feel hurt. You should know better given what I'm going through. How do you think that would have went?
I don't know that you would still be friends.
Exactly. And I had some of that initially, like she should know.
Right.
And I realized, thanks to the work we do in DBT, that wasn't going to go well. And that what I first needed to do was to not be focused on my intent, but on the impact, and to validate how she was feeling. And she was missing me and she was feeling dismissed. And to really address that first, to communicate like, I get it. Of course, you don't really know what's going on. I haven't been very communicative. And yeah, it feels bad to keep reaching out and to keep being told no. And so that when we can do that towards other people in our lives without being so focused on what our intent is or getting our point across first, when there's some kind of hurt feelings or interpersonal conflict, I feel like it's like aloe on a sunburn. It's very soothing. So this, calmed her down. We talked about it for a while. And then I could talk some about my intent and what was going on. But first and foremost, what was needed was a lot of validation and letting her know, like, I get it. And of course that would feel bad.
And I think that, as I'm listening to your story, I'm reminded of times when people have offered some sort of critique of me or expressed feeling invalidated by me. And I think it's really easy and natural in a way to be defensive when that wasn't our intent. So my intent wasn't to invalidate you or to hurt you. So therefore, I want to defend that's not what I meant. And one of the simplest forms of invalidation is that's not what I meant. And it's like, well, I don't care what you meant. This is how I feel. And so for me, I think that I find when I am able to start with identifying where the other person is coming from and just acknowledging their feelings, that cuts off my instinct towards defensiveness. And so validation actually can help me engage the conversation. And like you said, eventually be able to explain my intent. But if I explain my intent first, that's probably pretty invalidating.
Yes. And sometimes explaining your intent isn't necessary or needed, but there is a place for it after the validation happens. And I think one of the reasons why this is emphasized or taught as a skill in DBT is because many people who come into DBT have the experience of being chronically invalidated in their childhood and growing up. So being told over and over, that's not it, you're too sensitive, which we talked about a couple of episodes ago. And so it might be really hard then to know how to validate, first of all, yourself and how to validate others.
Right. I think that for many of us who have strong emotions, in childhood especially, we get a lot of you're overreacting. That's not really what you're feeling. And so then we learn to distrust our own emotions. And I've had my own experiences of being invalidated. I can remember a few years ago coming to a supervisor with a real frustration with some of the administrative stuff that we had to do in our work, and having my supervisor say, I don't understand why you're having such a strong reaction to this. Doesn't really make sense. And I immediately became very defensive and wanted to argue why it made sense to be frustrated by the administrative approach. And of course, I had, all of my evidence of other people I had talked to and everybody else who's complaining and whatever. And it was really a dead end conversation because my supervisor was invalidating me and I became defensive and was invalidating her. And so we had to just end the conversation and come back to it. And when we came back, both of us started with validation.
Oh, yeah. What did that look like?
And so of her being able to say, I understand that this is really frustrating. I'm wondering if we can talk about it. And for me to be able to say, I understand that it's hard to hear complaints about this administrative stuff. And when we ended the first conversation, it was very tense. But when we came back, it was so much more productive. We were able to address things. We both felt heard by the other person because we started with, I understand. So if that wasn't what I meant, is kind of a very base level invalidation, I understand is a base level validation.
Absolutely. I think that's a great illustration of how it can go awry without validation or with invalidation, and how things can get more smoothly, or how things can go more smoothly when it's a tricky subject and there's power dynamics with a supervisor, and how much validation sort of eases that conversation along. And if you don't understand what the other person is saying, because sometimes you may not, a way of validating, even if you don't really get it, is saying something like, I don't understand, but I want to. Can you tell me more about what's going on? So at least you're communicating to the other person that you're trying to get it. So I don't want to say that validation means that you have to understand it, because sometimes we don't. But showing that we care enough to ask, I don't get it, but please tell me more. I want to try to get it.
Right. I want to understand.
Yeah. So really important. And so let's talk a little bit about how validation is actually different than just agreeing. Because I know when we talk about validation, sometimes in our skills group, this can get a little bit confusing. So when we're talking about validation, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're agreeing with the other person saying, what they're doing or what they're feeling. So not only do you not have to necessarily agree, you also don't necessarily have to like what they're saying. So for example, suppose your boyfriend comes home from work and they're feeling really angry at their supervisor, to use another work example. And you're thinking, I can't validate my boyfriend's anger at their supervisor because I know the facts and the history, and I don't feel like they have a right to be angry. And so you may feel like if you validate the fact that they're angry, that you're saying that they're right to feel their anger. And so you could imagine how it might go if you start off the bat, if they come home and they say, look, I'm really angry. This thing happened at work. And you come back with, well, I don't think you have a right to feel angry because X, Y, Z, right? It's probably not going to go well.
Probably not.
But if you can say, I get it, I understand that you're angry, what this does, it can really calm down the other person. And this in relationships can really help things not escalate. In this case, it can help your boyfriend feel understood and not hurt. And there can be a time and place later on to talk in more perhaps of a wise mind place about what happened and maybe some of your views.
Yeah, so I think that, in these kinds of conversations, to start with validation, and that, helps the other person feel heard, feel understood, can de-escalate if they're really having strong emotion. And then, and I like the idea of just, I get why you're angry, period, right? But there is a difference between, I get why you're angry, but your supervisor has a point, and I get why you're angry, and I wonder where your supervisor is coming from. But again, if someone's really upset, I get why you're angry, and I wonder where your supervisor's coming from, may seem invalidating. So I get why you're angry is probably the best approach.
Right, to start with. And what you're talking about here is the but and. So when we do I get why you're angry, but it sort of negates that whole, I get why you're angry. And the emphasis is on the but. And if you can do, I get why you're angry, and that allows for the dialectic piece, that two things can be true at the same time. You can both understand why your boyfriend is angry, and are there factors to consider? And as you said, Ed, there's, timing is everything in these kind of discussions. So that's something to think about. So another example of validating, but not necessarily agreeing with, is let's say you are hosting a get together at your place and your neighbor knocks on your door and is pretty upset and irritated because they think that one of your friends has blocked their driveway. And you know for a fact that none of your friends have done that because they all took the bus to get you. Let's just say that. So you can validate like, oh yeah, wow, that's really frustrating. Someone is blocking your driveway. That's validation. But you're not validating something that isn't true, that it was one of your friend's cars. If you respond to your neighbor with, well, none of my friends did that, and I don't know what your problem is, it's, right? We're going to have some problems. Yeah.
Right. And so, validation is very helpful and valuable. And for me, I think having a conscientiousness of trying to start with validation helps a lot. And it's kind of tricky to be able to validate someone's emotions without necessarily validating the context. For instance, if you know that your friends didn't block their driveway, right? But I think that there's levels to how we validate, and starting with, lower levels is always a better place to start.
Yes. And let's talk about, since you're talking about levels, like some of the how-to of validation. So how to actually validate someone when you're talking with them. And like the first most basic level is to pay attention. It communicates to the other person that they matter, and that in and of itself, sort of at a fundamental level, is validating. And maybe we should talk a little bit about like the subtle and not so subtle ways that we don't actually pay attention.
Right. I think that, for instance, if somebody's talking to you about something that's important to them and my phone buzzes and I go to check it, that's a form of invalidation. I'm not totally paying attention to that person. And unfortunately, I've done that and I've had it done to me.
Yes.
And I very much don't like it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, are you busy? Do you need to take that call? Am I bothering you? And so just really like trying to be attentive when we're talking to someone, especially if they're expressing their emotions, to really be focused on them, listening to them, paying attention to what they have to say, not giving in to other distractions.
Yes. I think the point about smartphones is so important because it's so pervasive. You're talking with someone close to you, they're looking at their phone. It's that continual kind of distraction, and it feels really bad to be with someone and try to communicate something and they're distracted that way. And I know I have also done it. And when I have been the person who's listening and I get distracted by my phone, I think I often think that I can give a good excuse that it makes, oh, this is just really important, or like an I'm sorry is going to make it okay. And it really doesn't. It's so much easier to see how it feels bad when it's done to us versus when we are doing that to someone else. So if you find yourself doing that, watch the judgments. And we talked about being non-judgmental in a previous episode, and recommit to paying attention. One way to think about paying attention is bringing basic mindfulness skills on board. So just
I think that using that mindfulness of observing what's going on, being in the moment with that other person gives me a focus so that if my phone buzzes, I know I can notice it, but that's not what's important. So I'm drawing my attention back to the conversation.
Yes. In addition to phones, even if you're not being distracted by your phone, there's all sorts of other subtle ways we can invalidate by not paying attention. So that could be maybe not making eye contact. It could be thinking about something else while the person is talking, like just waiting for them to finish so you could say your piece.
Right.
So you're not really focused on them.
And we pick those things up. Like when we're talking, we can tell when someone's not totally fully attentive. And so I think it's worthwhile when I am listening to use those mindfulness skills to really be focused on the person that I'm listening to.
Mm-hmm. And something you can do if you're in a moment of intense distraction, or you're trying to juggle something important coming in on your phone, or your whatever might be on your mind, if you can, like if time allows, you might be able to think about saying to the other person, you know what, I'm super distracted right now. Can we have this conversation in 10 minutes? I really want to hear what you have to say. So that's something to think about to help get you paying attention and being mindful when you're having a conversation. And let's move on to the next level, like a higher level of validation. So the first level is just paying attention. The next level, we could say, is reflecting back what you heard without judgment. So this might be called reflective listening, where you're letting the other person know that you heard them accurately and you're not adding to what you heard. You're just like, oh yeah. So you're saying you feel XYZ.
So for example, you can imagine that you're on a hike with a friend and you start to climb up a steep hill. And towards the top of the hill, there's a lookout point where some other hikers have gathered. And there's a guardrail and people are leaning against it and looking down at the beautiful view. And your friend stands back and says, I'm scared to go to the guardrail because it's too close to the edge. You can validate your friend is scared without having to agree that it is dangerous, meaning that there is something to be scared of. So first you just put yourself in their shoes and say, yeah, we're really high up and that can be scary, without having to agree that it is scary. Then, you can just go and you get close to the edge and go by the guardrail and take your pictures or whatever, but not saying, oh, don't be silly. Come on. It's not that high. There's a guardrail. What's the big deal? But by just saying, yeah, it is like, this is really high up. That's pretty scary, is a form of reflecting back what your friend has said, validating their experience without necessarily having to say, okay, well, then let's go back down.
Right. Exactly. And I have been on the receiving end of, it's not a big deal. This is safe. This is a secure guardrail. That doesn't actually help. Like, it doesn't help calm down my fear.
Right.
And so if I could hear the validation, I think it could be very calming in the moment. Like, oh yeah, we are really high up. And the third level of validation that I want us to talk about is something called reading minds. And this is an important piece of how we conceptualize validation in DBT. And it's sort of, again, a more advanced level of validation that can be powerful, but I think can also be tricky. So when we're trying to read minds, as we call it in DBT, we're trying to figure out what's going on with the other person without them having to tell us.
And we're not literally trying to read their mind, but we're basically trying to read their body language, read their mood. We're trying to notice what they're feeling without them having to put it into words. So noticing that they're, kind of hunched over and they're looking down and maybe they're feeling sad, or notice that their face is really scrunched up and their hands are clenched. Maybe they're really angry, and being able to notice that without them having to verbalize it.
Right. And I think one of the tricky things about this is that when you're doing this mind reading, you want to do it with a light touch when you let the other person know that you're picking up on something. So you might say something like, I have a feeling you might be upset, or I'm wondering if you're upset with me. And this can make the other person feel deeply understood and seen versus kind of insisting, I know you're angry at me.
Right.
And kind of going down that road.
Right.
And the important thing is to trust the person, because maybe you're off. You might be picking up on something. You might be really certain, sort of energetically, you're sensing this person is upset with you or they're sad or whatever they might be, but be open to hearing what their reality is.
Right. And be willing to be wrong. So that, for me, I find it really helpful to just say, you seem really sad, or it seems like what I just said was frustrating for you. And using the word seems because I am guessing it seems, I don't know. And so it seems like what I said is frustrating. And if they say no, take them at their word and let it be.
Right. And that's a hard part about mind reading. But if you can do it, again, with a light touch, it can feel so good to the other person. It feels great to be on the receiving end, to have someone who knows us well enough, who can just sort of pick up on things like, oh, you're kind of frustrated, huh? And that's a very wonderful kind of validation to receive. And I think, we're all sort of doing this all the time to one extent or another. And especially with couples, there's a way that couples are exquisitely attuned to each other, and they really notice those subtle shifts in energy and body language with their partner. And then they make all sorts of assumptions based on this, which has a positive because there's fine attunement. And so they can sense if maybe their partner needs something or is having a hard time. But it also, as we're talking about, can create these problems. So if you assume if your partner gets a little bit quiet and maybe no one else would notice, but you know them really well, and so they're a little bit quiet and you assume they're angry at you, you might, if you don't check that out with them, like, are you upset with me? You might begin to shift how you're behaving. So maybe you get a little short or a little distant. And then maybe they weren't angry to begin with. Maybe they were just feeling tired or distracted, or who knows. And then, but you've gotten short with them and you're getting a little irritated and they respond to that. And this is how cycles sort of build, where couples are like confused, like, why are we arguing? What just happened?
Right. And so I think a key part of reading minds as validation is to notice what's going on and then check it out. That if we notice and assume, we could very easily be off. So we notice and then we reflect that back and try to check it out and see, is what I'm noticing what you're experiencing?
All right. So thank you again, Ed, for joining me to talk about validation. So we talked about what invalidation is, and then what validation is, how to do it, why it's so important, and the different levels of validating someone else, which are, just to recap, are to pay attention, kind of basic level validation, to reflect back without judgment, and to try to kind of read someone's mind.
And there are more levels of validation that we can talk about later, but that's a good start.
Great. Thanks again. Thanks for listening to today's episode. To learn more, or if you're in the Bay Area and want to get started with therapy, you can find us online at bayarea.dbtcc.com. That's bayarea.dbtcc.com.